Some of the most emotionally exhausted people you know are still showing up every day with a smile on their face. They answer messages, go to work, make jokes, pay bills, sit in traffic, say I'm good without thinking twice. And nobody notices anything is wrong. Because the truth is, human beings can become extraordinarily skilled at hiding themselves. Not only from other people, but from themselves. And maybe that is one of the most terrifying things about modern life. You can slowly disappear inside your own personality without anyone realizing it, including you. At first, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels practical. You learn very early which parts of yourself are acceptable, and which parts are not. Maybe your sadness made people uncomfortable. Maybe your sensitivity was called weakness. Maybe your excitement was mocked. Maybe your honesty pushed people away. So you adapt. Quietly. Naturally. You become easier to love. Easier to manage. Easier to understand. You learn how to laugh at the right moments. How to avoid saying too much. How to become whatever version of yourself creates the least friction in the room. And eventually, people begin praising you for it. They call you mature, easygoing, reliable, successful. But what they often mean is, you have learned how not to burden others with your humanity. And for a while, that works. Until one day you realize something unsettling. The version of yourself everyone seems to love doesn't actually feel like you anymore. That realization changes people. Because once someone begins sensing that their entire identity has become performative, life starts feeling strangely unreal. You wake up tired for reasons you cannot explain. Conversations begin feeling hollow. Achievements feel emotionally distant. Even moments that are supposed to make you happy feel muted somehow. As if your life is happening slightly outside of yourself. And what makes this experience so painful is that from the outside, everything may still appear completely normal. That's the part nobody talks about. Many people are not collapsing dramatically. They are collapsing quietly. In ways that look functional. The high-achieving student who secretly feels empty. The father who hasn't emotionally relaxed in 20 years. The woman who spends her entire life making everyone comfortable while slowly disappearing internally. The friend who is always the funniest person in the room because humor is the only way they know how to feel accepted. Some people become so good at performing stability that nobody ever thinks to ask if they are suffering, including themselves. And modern society rewards this behavior constantly. We live in a culture deeply obsessed with image. People are encouraged to optimize themselves endlessly. Be attractive. Be productive. Be confident. Be emotionally controlled. Be socially desirable. And above all else, never slow down long enough to confront what you actually feel. So people become disconnected from themselves gradually. Not through one catastrophic event, but through thousands of tiny moments of self-abandonment. Every time you say yes when you mean no. Every time you suppress emotion to avoid rejection. Every time you pretend to agree just to keep the peace. Every time you shape your personality around what earns approval. You move slightly further away from yourself. And the frightening thing is that this process often feels normal. Because everybody else is doing it too. That's why so many people secretly feel exhausted by social interaction. It is tiring to maintain an identity that does not fully belong to you. It is tiring to constantly monitor yourself. To calculate how you are being perceived. To wonder if people would still accept you if they saw the parts of you that are uncertain, emotional, strange, insecure, imperfect. So instead, many people become actors inside their own lives. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. Simply because they are afraid. Afraid of rejection. Afraid of abandonment. Afraid that if they stop performing, they will stop being loved. And honestly, that fear is understandable. Human beings are wired for belonging. From an evolutionary perspective, social rejection once threatened survival itself. Which means many of our behaviors today are still driven by ancient emotional instincts. We want connection, approval, safety. And because of that, we often confuse fitting in with being loved. But those are not the same thing. Being accepted for a performance is not the same as being known. In fact, one of the loneliest feelings in the world is realizing people love a version of you that was created entirely for their comfort. Because now you face an impossible question. If I stop being this person, who am I? A lot of people avoid that question for their entire lives. They distract themselves instead. With work. With entertainment. With relationships. With constant noise. Because silence is dangerous. Silence forces self-confrontation. And self-confrontation can feel unbearable when you no longer know what parts of your identity are real. This is why so many people experience a strange emptiness after reaching goals they thought would finally fulfill them. They get the promotion, the relationship, the money, the recognition. And for a brief moment, there is relief. But not peace. Because external achievement cannot heal internal disconnection. No amount of success can replace a relationship with yourself. And eventually, the emotional cost of disconnection begins appearing somewhere. Sometimes as anxiety. Sometimes as burnout. Sometimes as addiction. Sometimes as emotional numbness. Sometimes as the inability to feel fully present in your own life. People often assume these struggles appear suddenly. But usually they are symptoms of long-term self-separation. A person can only suppress themselves for so long before something begins breaking internally. And unfortunately, society often misunderstands this completely. We praise people for being endlessly productive while ignoring whether they are emotionally alive. We admire composure more than honesty. Performance more than authenticity. Efficiency more than meaning. So people learn to become functional instead of whole. And there is a difference. A machine can function. A human being needs meaning. Without meaning, life slowly starts becoming mechanical. Wake up. Work. Consume. Distract yourself. Sleep. Repeat. And somewhere in the middle of all that movement, many people quietly lose contact with the deeper parts of themselves. Their curiosity. Their vulnerability. Their wonder. Their emotional truth. That is why some people feel strangely nostalgic for childhood. Not because childhood was perfect. But because it was one of the last times they existed before becoming overly conscious of how they were perceived. Children cry openly. Laugh freely. Become fascinated by small things. They have not yet mastered the art of self-surveillance. But adulthood often teaches people to monitor themselves constantly. To become socially acceptable versions of themselves. And while some level of social adaptation is necessary, problems begin when adaptation becomes self-erasure. Because eventually, the mask hardens. What began as protection becomes identity. And after enough years, many people no longer know how to remove it. That is where the deepest existential exhaustion begins. Not from hard work. Not from failure. But from the unbearable effort of trying to maintain a self that feels emotionally false. And perhaps the tragedy is that many people do not even realize this is what they are experiencing. They simply assume adulthood feels empty. But life is not supposed to feel emotionally distant all the time. You are not meant to spend your entire existence performing for invisible judgment. You are not meant to abandon yourself in exchange for social approval. At some point, every person must decide whether they want to be accepted or whether they want to be real. And yes, being real is risky. Some people may misunderstand you. Some relationships may change. Some environments may reject the version of you that no longer performs constantly. But pretending has consequences too. And often those consequences are much more destructive. Because when you spend years disconnected from yourself, eventually you begin feeling disconnected from life itself. Nothing reaches you deeply anymore. You stop feeling genuine excitement, genuine intimacy, genuine presence. You survive, but you do not fully live. And maybe that is why honesty is so powerful. Not brutal honesty, not impulsive emotional expression, but honest alignment. Living in a way where your inner world and outer world are no longer completely at war with each other. That kind of honesty changes people. It changes the way they speak, the way they form relationships, the way they spend time, the way they define success. They stop asking, "How do I become impressive enough to deserve love?" and start asking, "What kind of life actually feels meaningful to live?" That question changes everything. Because meaningful lives rarely look perfect from the outside. They simply feel real from the inside. And strangely enough, authenticity often creates deeper connection than performance ever could. Why? Because human beings are starving for sincerity. Everyone is exhausted by pretending. Everyone is carrying fears they rarely admit out loud. The fear of not being enough. The fear of disappointing people. The fear of being truly seen. But the moments that create the deepest human connection are almost always the moments where performance stops. Where someone finally says, "This is who I really am. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I actually feel." And instead of rejection, they experience recognition. Because beneath all our differences, most people are fighting battles that sound emotionally similar. We all want to feel understood. We all want to feel valued. We all want to feel that our existence matters beyond what we produce. And perhaps this is why art affects human beings so profoundly. A song, a film, a book, a conversation. Sometimes they remind us that our inner chaos is not unique. That someone else has felt this too. That someone else has sat awake at night feeling disconnected from themselves and the world around them. And in those moments, loneliness softens slightly. Because to feel understood, even briefly, is one of the most healing experiences a human being can have. Maybe that is the real purpose of authenticity. Not self-expression for attention. Not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. But connection. Real connection. The kind that only becomes possible when something genuine is finally allowed to exist between people. And maybe that begins with a very simple decision. To stop abandoning yourself. To stop shaping your entire identity around being digestible for everyone else. To stop treating your humanity like a problem that needs to be hidden. Because your life cannot become meaningful while you are emotionally absent from it. At the end of life, people rarely regret being imperfect. They regret being disconnected. They regret never saying what mattered. Never becoming who they truly were. Never allowing themselves to be known. And perhaps the saddest thing is not that so many people suffer silently. Perhaps the saddest thing is how many people believe they must continue suffering silently in order to remain lovable. But they don't. You do not have to earn your humanity by becoming emotionally invisible. You do not have to perform constantly to deserve connection. You do not have to become less of yourself in order to belong. And maybe healing begins the moment you finally realize that. Maybe healing begins when you stop asking the world, "Will you accept me?" And finally ask yourself, "Have I accepted myself?" Because a person who is deeply disconnected from themselves can receive endless approval and still feel empty. But a person who learns to live honestly, even imperfectly, can begin feeling alive again. And in a world filled with performance, distraction, and emotional hiding, that kind of honesty becomes something incredibly rare. Not weakness. Not selfishness. Not failure. Courage.